Okay, and we are back on From Change to Change. I am Bruce Reilly, DJ Bruja, your favorite podcast hoster. And I have an incredible guest today who is Miss Lydia Pelot-Hobbs, and she has an amazing book called Prison Capital, Mass Incarceration and Struggles for Abolition Democracy in Louisiana. And believe me when I tell you, this is our book. And this is a book that I encourage everybody to read. We're going to get into it a little bit. And I'm really grateful for your scholarship, Lydia. And first, I just want to say, hey, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Bruce. I'm so happy to be here. And it's so kind that you want to talk about this project. It really means a lot to me.
So where are you now?
I am right now at the University of Kentucky, where I'm currently an assistant professor in geography and African American Africana studies. So I've been here for about 4 years, although, as you know, and some other people do who might be listening, that I have been back and forth in Louisiana since I took this job and was in New Orleans for a good 10 plus years before coming up here to Kentucky. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure when I first met you, I'm just gonna guess it was like a vote meeting or something.
Probably.
Or
Yeah.
And realizing, I remember Norris telling me like, yeah, there's this like grad student, she's like writing about Angola, about the Special Civics Project. I got to know you a little bit and knew that like you really been honing in a lot of this post-Katrina activity in our city and the policing and such. But I guess just generally my first question would be like, tell us a little bit about sort of the inspiration to tackle this subject and your choices of the way I see it. There's kind of three kind of main chapters to it in a way that blend together. Give us a little bit about how you approach that.
So I was initially, so I would like to say that this project really came out of the moments of grassroots organizing that I feel so fortunate that I got to participate in the immediate aftermath of Katrina. So those first, 5 years after the storm, many of which, I was recruited by a mentor and friends to kind of support some organizing around the abandonment of the city jail, or OPP, during Hurricane Katrina, the leaving of incarcerated people there for dead, trying to get amnesty for them. And then through that work, ended up actually volunteering for a number of years at Safe Street Strong Communities, where I first met Norris Henderson, and was really, through that organizing work and supporting criminalized and formerly incarcerated people and their loved ones, struggles for more free Louisiana. You heard the sentence a lot, which is Louisiana is the most incarcerated place in the world, right? That sentence was just repeated. And I was a nerd and I was curious. And so I went looking for a lot of answers, and some things I was getting out of through the kind of work of organizing, right? So stories from Norris Henderson, from the late Althea Francois, and many other folks really helped me kind of understand the broader picture. But I had a lot of questions. So I went looking for books. And the last monograph, so not a memoir, they're beautiful memoirs that have been published, not like a little article about the Angola prison rodeo, which there are dozens of, but a real kind of analysis of Louisiana's march to mass incarceration, I couldn't find. It didn't exist. So I went off to graduate school to answer some questions. And initially this took the form of me doing a master's project at the University of New Orleans, from where I was trying to figure out what I was going to write my master's thesis about. And so for years, I'd been having these pretty informal conversations with Norris about the organizing he had been doing in Angola, with the Angola Special Civics Project and the work folks had been doing around life without parole sentencing and so much more. And at one point, I was talking to Norris and I said to him, oh, has anyone written about this? Assuming someone must have, right? Because it was this really powerful story of organizing. And he said, no one's written about this. And I said, well, would it be helpful if I decided to make this my master's thesis? And Norris is generous and kind and said, yeah, that's a great idea. So he sat with me for many interviews. He pointed me in the direction of the Angolite, which is the prisoner news magazine at Angola. He introduced me to folks to interview, which included folks like Vicki Johnson, Chico Yancey, many other folks who had been involved in that work. And I ended up writing a master's thesis about the Angola Special Civics Project, right? And from there, just more and more questions opened up. I ended up having more questions. I ended up going the route of getting a PhD and doing this dissertation. So what I initially thought was a project that was going to be either about kind of the 1980s or the immediate post-Katrina years really expanded out. I found out I need to learn some more things about the 70s. I learned I had to learn a lot about the political economy of Louisiana, specifically on oil and tourism, which is not where I thought I was going to go, but became really central to this project. And that I also really wanted to highlight, especially, but not only, the kind of rich stories of anti-prison and anti-policing organizing in Louisiana, which is often left out of the story, right? It's often a story of it's the worst of the worst, or it's so backward, or it's the most racist, or it's the most classist, and all of those things, are true to some degrees, right? Things are terrible often. And also there has been so many wins, so much collective power built, so much, kind of deep analysis that I actually wanted to also be clear that the story could not just be the story of kind of the state's march to mass incarceration or the building up of prisons, jails, and policing, but also really thinking seriously about how do people organize against mass incarceration or the carceral state and all of these different kind of crevices of the state itself, and how can those learnings and those struggles be sources of knowledge for folks who are fighting back in Louisiana, but also in, say, New York or Idaho or Texas or where have you. So that's a little bit about the origins of the project and what kind of animated my thinking.
Yeah, it's great. I really love how you do merge the oppression and the pushback, which I do think is great for a reader who might be thinking about, well, how do we deal with the current situation? Like, what have people done before? What might work? And it's amazing how much of your book, which recounts various governors, various the Harry Connick era, that they're just pulling out the old playbook like time and again. But one of the coolest things as a fellow nerd for me when I open up your book, and I don't know if it's in the introduction or like really early on, maybe page 1, you start talking about the 1973 OPEC oil crisis.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, I can get into this because I've long had my theories of my own education and whatnot while I was incarcerated, which is really tying incarceration to labor and to capitalism, because a lot of people, they'll say something which may not be super thought out, right? It might be like, oh, like prisons and capitalism or something. And it's like, yeah, you've got a nice sign, but you're not really like diving in. And I'm not sure you actually know how, but your hunch is correct, and and so I love how you mentioned prison labor and talking about like the post New Deal, and you talk about Keynesian. Is it Keynesianism? Is that how you say it?
That's one of the ways. He was British, so there's Keynesian.
Keynesianism?
I think in Britain they say Keynesianism. I think in the US we say Keynesianism. It's fine. It's all good.
Can you give us, just the dumbed down version of Keynesian kind of principles, like the economy, and why that matters in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Keynesianism, right, is a political economic program by this guy, John Keynes, who's a British political economist, really an economist, that had the idea that in response, he predated kind of the Great Depression, but the general idea is like when there's an economic crisis, when there's a recession, when there's a downturn, what do you do? And his idea was that you increase, in all of these ways, government spending so that you can get the economy moving again. So in the United States, we saw that really taken up in the New Deal or under FDR. So the idea that you would expand a welfare state, right? So on one hand, it's like, how do we start building out literally new roads, new schools, work like the WPA, the Works Projects Association, so that there's more work that people can be doing. Also, how do you, this is the creation of things like unemployment benefits, of Social Security benefits. So the idea is if there isn't enough money, you give people money, either directly or indirectly, to get the economy kind of driving again. And the idea is that the state's job under a kind of Keynesian system is to increase those dollars and cents so that people have their ability to survive, right? And also to kind of shift these dynamics. So we often think of it as the welfare state. So another way of thinking about it, for me at least, is it's like the predominant form that capitalism took, because it's not anti-capitalist, right? But it's to quote Ruthie Wilson Gilmore, it's capitalism saving capitalism from capitalism, which is a mouthful. But it's a way to think about, right, if there was like this super crisis of the Great Depression, it was like, oh, we don't want people to have like full revolution, right, and end capitalism,
Right.
but like, can we make a nicer capitalism that kind of gets contained? So it's pro-union, more environmental regulations, things like that. So you kind of give some people some things who are out in the streets, and then you're able to kind of stabilize the economy. And that really, took hold and was the dominant form of kind of US political economy from, FDR's taking it on in the 30s till about, the OPEC price hikes in the
Yeah.
1970s when we started to have a shift in our kind of understanding of what the state's role in the economy is in the US.
Yeah. And so, I've once upon a time I encountered this line by the robber baron industrialist
Mhm.
Jay Gould, who said,
Mm,
"I could pay half the working class to kill the other half."
yeah.
And so I've always thought about that and used
Hmm.
it around incarceration. And
Totally.
so, as you're talking about, like obviously during the 30s, the New Deal was designed to be like, oh, these are like helpful jobs, right? Like
Right.
roads, electricity, dams,
Hmm.
like
Yeah.
people are doing like mass labor things. And of course, we know that there's before that even prison labor
Totally.
doing all of our levies and such. And
Right.
so, but then you get into a war economy, World War II.
Right.
Still, it's government pumping money into
Yeah.
bombs and tanks and guns, and
Yeah.
then those things are
Right.
being depleted. They got to be
Right.
replenished.
Hmm.
And then we get into sort of like the 70s,
Right.
and we get into, wait, we don't have a war economy anymore.
Hmm.
We're not doing like socialist kind of like helpful build schools kind of stuff.
Right.
But now we have a new version of kind of the same principle
Hmm.
of let's like put people to work to do something.
Right.
And what are they putting people to work doing now? They're
Yeah.
policing and they're jailing.
Right.
And
Right.
I
So.
just, it's like, how do we get out of this loop? And so when we see like even automation putting more humans
Hmm.
out of work, we
Hmm.
know that the
Hmm.
exportation of jobs out of America
Hmm.
really crushed labor. And a lot of people get that, but they don't necessarily add that extra connection of like unemployment to poverty to crime to
Right.
addiction to prisons.
Right.
And then you have this like self-sustaining kind of loop. How do you break that cycle?
Right. So there becomes, right, and I think this is exactly right. So you have this kind of new era of crisis that emerges from, shifts in the political economy, whereby particularly, but not only, right, Black folks, right, have historically have, doubled the unemployment of white people at anywhere in the country at any given day, right? So if the economy is good, that still number tends to hold. If the economy is bad, it also holds, right?
Mm-hmm.
So increasingly, right, you start seeing, and I think this is why it's so important to talk about this, right? The ways to manage unemployment crises doesn't become giving people jobs or figuring out how to give them increased welfare payments or what have you, but
Mm-hmm.
starting to kind of contain people or warehousing people in prisons and jails, while prisons and jails are increasingly getting sold as a false economic process to local communities. We also know that prisons and jails,
Mm-hmm.
right, don't actually they don't do what prison boosters and jail boosters say they will in terms of economic development, but it's really compelling because it's often the only thing that's being offered to struggling, particularly rural and suburban communities. At the same time as there's this massive warehousing of particularly Black, but not only Black folks, to manage these kind of crises, right? Because there's a fear of otherwise there's going to be revolt or there's going to be strikes or what have you. And so the answer is to kind of increasing up the police state. So I talk about
Mm-hmm.
this in the book as we can understand it as like there's a direct relationship between disinvestments and kind of social infrastructures and the
Mm-hmm.
ratcheting up of punitive power as like something that go hand in hand, more or less, from the 70s, 80s to the present day.
Yeah, I remember Howard Zinn, he I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if he coined the phrase, but
Mm-hmm.
he's talking about the revolt of the gatekeepers and
Mm-hmm.
pointing out how many working class people are critical to
Right.
upholding
Mm-hmm.
some of these structures. And
Mm-hmm.
the majority of people who work for the DOC right now are actually Black women.
Totally.
And and so the reality is, to connect it to race and racial
Mm-hmm.
oppression,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in the end, it's required to maintain sort of like half the folks keeping down the
Mm-hmm.
other half of the
Yeah.
folks
Yeah.
kind of approach.
Yeah.
Um, But so some of the things you get into, because I really love how you talk about specific policies and
Mhm,
the that I think are helpful for the readers to think
mhm,
about now, or the world that they are most familiar with.
mhm,
Maybe it's the last 10 years, last 20 years, whatever, wherever they kind of get in.
mhm.
But you talk about like 1967, like stop
Yeah.
and frisk here
Mhm.
in New Orleans being
Yeah.
like a thing. And then 1968, Nixon's omnibus policing bill, crime
Mhm.
bill, that was really, and of course, for people to understand, right? Did that come out of nowhere? Or what
No,
was the context of the times?
no, of course it didn't come out of nowhere, right? So, if we're thinking about 1967 and 1968, right, for folks who aren't familiar, right? So often, there is this, the 60s are a time of, massive organizing, massive protests, right? Both civil rights organizing, Black and Brown power organizing, anti-war organizing, right? It's a deep moment. And so we have in response, especially in the late 60s, right? There's a kind of series of rolling rebellions happening in cities across the United States. So we could think about, Watts in LA in 1965, Detroit and Newark in 67, and then literally and many other places in between, and then just countless places following the assassination of Dr. King in 68. And so there's this real kind of intensification of policing as a way to kind of put down these kinds of protests, right? And I think what's really interesting to me is there's a real debate happening during this period of time. So you both have kind of anti-racist organizers with folks like the Black Panther Party and what have you saying, our answer is like, we either need community control over police, we need no more police, right? There's a kind of host of different positions being taken, but there's a real clear identification of police violence, right, as the problem, both in its
Mhm.
extraordinary, like someone's getting killed, or its everyday form, like everyday shutdowns that are just, terrible and humiliating. And you also have folks on the kind of growing right wing, and which is really ascendant at this moment, although it doesn't know it's ascendant yet. We might that folks in the 60s probably didn't think that's what was happening, but that's where we're going when
Mhm.
we think about someone like Nixon saying our answer is to double down on policing as this answer in this moment. And we're going to do this. And this is where the liberals sometimes get into play. They're like, we're going to professionalize the police. So they won't just
Mhm.
like kill someone randomly, but we'll professionalize them. We'll hire Black cops. We'll diversify
Mhm.
the police. But at the same time, we will ratchet up the amount of power that they have. So for folks who aren't familiar with it, the 1968 Omnibus Safe Streets Act under Nixon, right, was the first federal law enforcement policy that would fund federal dollars to local law enforcement in the history of the United States, right? So it's this massive moment of expanding people's ability to police.
Mhm.
And they also say they're going to do training, they're going to make it nice so they make it a bipartisan project, right? But it's really in
Mhm.
response to these kinds of anti-racist organizing of the era, and the kind of creation of what is articulated as the war on crime under Nixon and by other folks,
Mhm.
right? And this idea of the war on crime, I think it's important to note, was first developed by kind of law enforcement leaders in the United States. And then they got folks like Nixon to take it on, right? So it's,
Mhm.
the police are literally coming up with these ideas. They are getting kind of particular politicians to carry them, and then they're becoming the law of
Mhm.
the land, which is increasing policing, which of course you increase the number of police on the street, you increase the number of people getting arrested, you increase the number of people
Mhm.
getting locked up. Um, and so in the case of a place like New Orleans, right, stop and frisk, which is often, I think, imagined as a more kind of 1990s policing tactic, right,
Mhm.
actually gets legislated by the city council in 67 by someone on the council who's had many generations of family members in law enforcement in New Orleans and the NOPD and in city council, really supporting this, say this is what we have to do because there's, right, this real imagination of Black folks, particularly Black men, particularly poor and working class Black men, right, as this criminal threat that needs to
Mhm.
be, that white folks need to be protected from, right? And it's going to kind of
Mhm.
shore up the city's public safety when what it really does, right, is it just, increases the number of people getting funneled into jails and prisons, right? Pretty nonstop from
Yeah.
that point forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard to imagine people who, let's just say, you fly into a city anywhere in the world,
Hmm.
and it's like militarized, and
Hmm.
then thinking like, oh, I'm safe. right?
Totally. Yeah.
Like you're gonna
Yeah.
think like, what's going on that you have to
Yeah.
have like these SWAT teams everywhere or these tanks
Hmm.
and stuff, and you're not going to feel safe. So this idea that we're just going to become a bunch of we're going to make it better for
Yeah.
the revelers by having
Yeah.
all this military gear. They're
Yeah.
going to not want to come.
Yeah.
And now we have a governor who is a former police officer,
Right.
and has makes no bones that he kind of views the political world through like a police officer lens.
Right.
And so there's no like confusion about that. And I guess the question is like, well, do we all agree with that lens? Obviously, many of us don't. But
Hmm.
my question is sort of knowing what we know about like 60s policing,
Hmm.
70s policing, kind of getting into the drug war.
Hmm.
And then obviously, our country hitting a critical moment with George Floyd.
Hmm.
And now we have a new set of like terms that we didn't necessarily have. We have
Yeah.
Black
Hmm.
Lives Matter, we have BLM, we've
Hmm.
got right-wing people using Antifa, sort of pretty,
Yeah.
see the thing, wokeism, like
Hmm.
Blue Lives Matter.
Hmm.
And so like what's different, if anything? And I mean this
Hmm.
like not
Yeah.
cynically,
Yeah.
what can we look at that changes things where we might have a different outcome or
Hmm.
different forces at work?
Hmm. Can I just ask one clarification from now and
Yeah.
at which point? Because there's so many different points, right?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, I mean, when was George Floyd again?
2020,
2020. So we're like almost
four
almost four
years.
years
Yeah.
into it.
Hmm.
And of course, for many of us who've been doing this kind of work, that clearly was just more of a sort of a critical moment, like a
Yeah.
spike on the graph, but a graph that has long since it existed. And I often think about police brutality in a timeline that actually has a huge asterisk with Rodney King,
Hmm.
and specifically about the camcorder,
Yeah.
but then another asterisk, which would be some rando guy that invented the phone camera on a Samsung that then
Right.
got stolen or whatever by the iPhone,
Yeah.
and then that has changed things.
Right.
So imagine if someone had videoed Emmett Till getting
Right.
beaten at the moment,
Right. Right.
So I think obviously body cams and surveillance footage hasn't really worked out so well for police. It's kind of backfired, at least in a
Hmm.
certain type of way.
Hmm.
So like how can we be leveraging that, I think, um, despite the fact that people don't necessarily want to be in a surveillance state. Like,
Yeah. It's interesting. It makes me think about the ways that we might consider, right? Like because I'm interested in the broader conditions, right? Because we know
mm,
that tons of folks are getting harassed, killed, beat by police officers every day in the United States. Only a fraction of those are caught on camera of some variety. I guess it also makes me think about, when does it become a spark and when does it not become the spark, right? Like, what are
mm,
the kind of dynamics that lead it to be shifting or kind of galvanized? And I think part of that question is where there is the infrastructure to also harness it, right? Like, where is it not
mm,
just that people are like, this is outrageous. Of course, this is what the police do all the time, everywhere. But also, where can that energy and anger be? At moments it turns into a protest, right? Which is important. And at moments it doesn't. But also in those moments that it turns into a protest, when does that protest turn into a longer form kind of organizing, right? That's
mm,
actually able to be harnessed for folks so that people are able to direct, the really honest and real feelings of grief and rage and frustration, right, into something that
mm,
is able to kind of shift power and make change. And I guess that's the question I keep coming back to. And
mm,
where is it become moments of nihilism? And I really think it's always a
mm,
question of where the organizing is, right? Because you can either be like, oh, this is just always what happens. It's terrible. There's nothing to be done. And then where are there the spaces or the places? Like, it doesn't surprise me, right, for George Floyd, right, a place like Minneapolis, which has had lots of organizing for so long, right, that their folks
mm,
were primed, right, for that
yeah,
moment. They were able to kind of take advantage of it. They were, there's also obviously the whole backdrop of the pandemic and what have you, but it becomes like, when are these moments turn into political opportunities for really shifting and mobilizing and organizing people? And when do they kind of flash up and flash back down again,
yeah.
right? And that
That's what I keep
becomes the real
thinking about.
question.
Yeah, in terms of like our work, like our structural work
Mhm,
is, and I hate to sort of frame it like this, but it's like, would we be ready? Thinking of this
mhm,
city or that city, like, are you
mhm,
ready for a George
mhm,
Floyd situation to
mhm.
respond, let's just say appropriately,
Right,
responsibly, like productively?
right.
Whether or not that people are ready to burn the whole place down is not the
Yeah,
question.
right.
And that actually is a unintentional segue
Mhm,
to, I mean, Norris and Biggie and Chico and them, they always talked about like, yeah, like we could burn this place down, but
yeah.
talking about Angola, but like then
Mhm,
they're just going to build a tent over here and put us. So that's not really
yeah,
the solution.
yeah.
And so forming the Angola Special Civics Project was about
Mhm,
kind of like figuring out some structural changes,
mhm,
particularly around the system that was overly incarcerating unfairly, as we know with
mhm,
all these wrongful convictions and
mhm,
everything. Um, but I guess I want to start with, you repeatedly mentioned Hayes Williams
mhm.
um, in the suit. How explain to folks a little bit about like why Hayes Williams is a critical person in the story.
Mhm. So there are these two guys initially, right? Hayes Williams and Arthur Mitchell, who were both incarcerated in Angola in the 70s. And, they end up in solitary, or they end up in a place called the Red Hat, which is a very particularly brutal form of solitary in Angola. After and I don't make any bones about this, right? They seek to escape from Angola, right? They try to escape, they get caught, they get sent to solitary, right? And from that moment forward, they started saying, okay, our goal is to take on the entire brutality of the system that is Angola. And when they're doing this, initially, this is in 1971, Angola is the only men's prison in Louisiana, which is hard to imagine now, right? And it has about 3,500 beds, right? So it is a fraction of the size that it is today. They have just opened St. Gabriel as the women's prison, but that's it, right? The landscape of the Louisiana kind of carceral state is literally there are buildings that are not there today, or then that are there today.
Mhm.
So they're trying to think about what is the ways they can take on the power of Angola. Because they're experiencing such brutal conditions, right? Of course, the reason why people escape is for obviously because it's a terrible place to be, right? So
Mhm.
they end up really building on what at that time had been a series of wins by Nation of Islam prisoners across the United 60s. Who were able to, win a whole bunch of lawsuits under the courts, initially around things like having access to being able to pray when they need to pray, right? To not be
Mhm.
force fed pork as their only protein source, things like that. And they really build up, from like a jailhouse lawyer perspective, they really build up a kind of foundation of legal precedent, right? And folks know this, right? Folks inside are hearing these stories, the stories are getting moved around. So they're like, okay, we are in a moment where the courts are favorable for us. Like, let's take on this broader kind of system. And they write out what is, the most extensive conditions of confinement lawsuit in Louisiana history, right? That talks about racial segregation in dorms and dining, the toxic conditions that people are living in. There's literally raw sewage underneath the dining halls. People are getting beat. Solitary is, incredibly dehumanizing and violent. There's inadequate healthcare, all the things we know about prisons. And they're able to submit it with the support of a lawyer that they get connected with, and two other guys join in on the suit, right? So these four folks submit this suit in 71. In the intervening years, a host of things happen, one of which is there's a real kind of panic amongst folks who are either governors or prison administrators or Department of Corrections secretaries following the Attica rebellion, right? So there's a real fear of like,
Mhm.
we don't want Attica happening here. Um,
Mhm.
and the courts are generally, they do a whole bunch of investigations and they, try to how do I put this? The like Department of Corrections is a whole bunch of things that try and kind of get around the suit by kind of implementing reforms before the suit comes on, the hopes that the courts will just say, oh, you guys have it, you've taken care of
Mhm.
it, don't worry about it. So they like someone named Elaine Hunt, right, comes in as the new Secretary of Corrections as a
Familiar name
reformer,
to
as a now a familiar name,
people.
right? Right, who's a reformist, like white lady, who's like, I'm going to clean up Angola. It's kind of her orientation. I'm going to get rid of these terrible things. We're going to make it better. We're going to make it like a good prison. It's kind of the way I think of Hunt. And when the courts find their kind of initial and final, their initial rulings, is they find for the plaintiffs, or they find for these four guys almost entirely, right? They say, yes, this is against the law, this is against the law. You know, all these things are either civil rights violations or they're against the 14th Amendment. There's all these different pieces there. I think it's notable, the one area they don't find for them is on the issue of solitary. They say solitary is an appropriate form of punishment, right? It's administratively important. And so they say, we're not even going to talk about that, which was the precipitating issue for these guys. But there's something really interesting happening. So Hunt at the time, she is really into this idea, which is kind of taking the nation in the 70s, this idea that you're going to close down prisons in kind of rural or kind of, how would I put it? More kind of remote locations, and you're going to replace them with kind of smaller urban prisons that are focused on rehabilitation, right? So there's this idea that if you just put prisons in a different geographic location, right, the harms of the prison will be alleviated. So Hunt, and I didn't know this till I started doing this research, argues for the decentralization of Angola, or literally shutting down Angola. She's like, we could just get rid of this prison. This prison is bad. Get rid of it. And we'll build a prison. She wanted to do one in New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport. She was like, these are the three main kind of places that people come from. They'll be closer to family and friends. We'll get better staff. This will be the plan. So by the time the courts rule, they say, okay, the courts also identify something that the plaintiffs had never said was an issue, which is that Angola is overcrowded, right? So by the time, I think like 1,000 more people had ended up in Angola, you know, overall, between the time the lawsuit was filed and 75 when the first ruling happened. So at this point, there's double bunking, there's triple bunking. And for this guy, first there was a Judge West, and then there was a Judge Polozola who oversaw these cases. They say, oh, it's overcrowding, and overcrowding is why there's violence. And if we could just stop overcrowding, that's it. So they're like, we're going to put a cap on the size of Angola. You cannot bring more people into this prison, right? That becomes like, yes.
Yeah, can I pause you for a moment there, because just so folks understand the context too. So 1973, Nixon launches the war on drugs. The same year that Connick runs for DA and is elected DA with his campaign against these career criminals, and using the multi-bill like massively, where people weren't getting any kind of parole. And then getting, what was it? I think you're right, $500 million of federal dollars he got to his program. So on the one hand, the judge is saying no more people, right? And then meanwhile, the Elaine Hunt of the world, just the door just keeps getting stuffed full of people.
Exactly.
And so that's the tension, right?
Right, that's the tension, right? So the courts are saying, which are federal, right? No more people through the Fifth Circuit. The Elaine Hunts are like trying to figure out a reformist strategy. And then you have Connick and many members of the state legislature, right, really going on a tough on crime spree. This is the beginning of this, right? So Connick is able to just, like unbelievably increase the amount of people who are doing time from Orleans Parish. And, he's leading the way for other DAs across the state in doing so, right? So it's like, things are on edge, things are at tension. So there's this moment where the judges say, okay, you can decentralize Angola, but you have to do it on this timeline. If you do not do it on this timeline, you have to figure out another plan, right? And so Hunt, working with then Governor Edwin Edwards, go around the state. They're trying to buy up land, they're trying to build new prisons, and everywhere they go, and I think this is a really important part of this story, everywhere they go, there's massive resident opposition to a new prison. And I want to be clear, most of the time, it's because of pretty kind of racist ideas about criminalized or incarcerated people, right, as dangerous or as outlaws and people not wanting them in their communities. But I think it's important to note, right, people they were like, we're not interested in this prison, right? So people are able to stop a school board from selling a school to becoming a prison, able to stop a nursing home in New Orleans East from becoming a prison, all of these different things. And at the same time, right, more and more people are getting arrested, convicted, or, plea bargain right into the prison system. And so eventually what ends up happening is the answer becomes not kind of building urban rehabilitative prisons or shuttering prisons or even letting people go. Because I think this is the other thing, right? If you have a problem of overcrowding, one of the tools at people's disposal would be doing mass early release. And in fact, in Texas at the exact same time, they're like letting out like thousands and thousands of people because they're like, we can't hold them. We're just gonna like parole people out early or what have, we're gonna, give people good time incentives. We're gonna increase their good time. Yeah. So that's not a political landscape.
Fun fact about Texas conditions, is one of my heroes when I was locked up, not that I knew much about him, but just is this guy, Fred Cruz, who was locked up since I think like 1960. And he learned to read in prison. And then he won this landmark. He filed a lot of cases around the conditions in Texas that became like the new standards for America. Cruz v. Baco. And one of his like religious arguments I found to be, I think, really potentially beautiful. I don't know the backstory, and if anyone's listening and does know the backstory, I'd love to know. But he basically went in as a Buddhist and talked about religious freedom. I don't think he was actually a Buddhist, but he needed standing to go in there, and he's really doing it on behalf of his Muslim brothers that were getting like really persecuted on the inside with this sort of like black nationalism, like white power, oppression. But a beautiful documentary by Suzanne Mason called Writ Writer. It was on PBS Independent Lens, and I met Suzanne like many years ago when they were just bringing the movie out, and I was like, wow, you actually made a movie about my hero, like totally like unsung person in the whole. And it turns out, in the grand scheme of things, he was actually innocent of the charge that he was railroaded on, similar to Norris. So it's funny who you put into prison and what might end up happening.
Exactly. Right. That's amazing. I had no idea about that. That's great. I have to check that out. But yeah, so where was I? No, that's wonderful. Yes. Oh, so they end up, the answer becomes, and this is where the OPEC price hike thing also really happens, because Louisiana is an oil state, right? So in the 1970s, most places are in a recession. Louisiana all of a sudden has more money than it knows what to do with. And initially, right, this is part of the idea, is that money could go to reforming the prisons, to putting more money into them. But so the DOC budget just grows by leaps and paths. And so they say, okay, we're caught between a rock and a hard place. The answer has become, because the people in the cities don't want these urban prisons, the numbers of people inside keep growing, there is no political will for early release, I guess we're going to expand Angola. So Angola gets expanded, and then the first standalone prison that is in Angola for men ends up being Dixon Correctional Institute, which is in East Feliciana Parish, which is right down the street, more or less, from Angola. It's rural. It goes against all the things they said it was going to be. And so you start having these new prisons get built in Louisiana from these kind of oil taxes, or mineral revenues is how they talk about it. And because there's just so much money, they don't even have to take out debt. They're just like, it's basically like Louisiana is printing money at this point. And while initially that money is going to many things, higher education, AFDC payments, new road and levee construction, it's also going to this massive prison buildup. So what ends up happening, and I say this in the book, is it's not a kind of decentralization program to shrink the size of Louisiana's kind of footprint of prisons, but you decentralize to grow the prison system overall. And that just sets the path over and over and over again. And again, I want to be really clear here. This is not a critique, to go back to Hayes Williams, of Hayes Williams or Arthur Mitchell or any of their imaginations. I don't think there was any way this could imagine what was going to happen. In fact, they write letters to the editor kind of calling this out as it's happening, saying this is against what we were trying to do in our lawsuit, right? This is not our aim, but I think it really was a profound lesson for a lot of folks of like conditions of confinement lawsuits are both important and at times can be leveraged to actually do the opposite, right? And it's tricky about the law. And it's really tricky, and it ends up leading to just kind of decades of, so the whole time that Louisiana builds its prison system out, it's under the Hayes Williams lawsuit, right? It's not until the late 90s that when the courts release Louisiana from it. And by then, all of the prisons have been built and what have you. So it becomes really complicated, and trying to think through what does that really mean for those of us who are trying to understand these different mechanisms and how these different growth patterns happen.
Yeah, so let me bring us to now, and then that can spring us back there again by talking about the sheriffs. And interestingly, anyone will tell you that the sheriffs are the most powerful political group in Louisiana. You know,
Yeah.
they're not term limited. They have a level of their own fiefdomism that is separate from city councils and mayors and such. They can raise their own taxes, and they get mad. Like most people, I think, you know, that obviously that do this kind of work, they understand that, you know, half roughly, and now it's over half of the people who are incarcerated for state crimes are being held in the parish jails that are run by these sheriffs. And you know, the per diem started in 1976. And I really love how you really, and you kind of have to keep coming back to it, because obviously this was like an expanding kind of system, right? That had these various iterations. And then at times the sort of like opposition from the sheriffs until it could be something that they were supportive of. And I love how you talk about like lease revenue bonds, something I became really familiar with a private prison up north. But give people a little sense of how that kind of happened, because as we know right now, the sheriffs are dependent upon something like $194 million from the state for this incarceration. And just as a sneak preview for people, I'm working on, maybe I'll finish it today, like a breakdown of the current DOC budget. And I'm going to do like it'll be a blog post, but it'll also be like a Twitter on our vote site, kind of like piece by piece with graphics and helping like kind of illustrating what these things mean and like what's going on behind these things. But why don't you take us kind of a little bit through, and you know, we don't get too nerdy, but I encourage people to read the book to like really kind of get the sense. But how the heck did this happen? Because other states aren't doing it.
No, although I will say this, right? I think Louisiana paved the way for things. There are more states doing it, right? And Louisiana is the first, right? Louisiana is the first. So, you know, I think it's interesting that you phrase it like this. Because I first, you know, in the years after Katrina was like, oh, there's this big struggle around Orleans Parish Prison. The per diem system is like central. The like question of why are we incarcerating state prisoners or jails, right? This is really kind of when I was learning about the contours of kind of the Louisiana criminal justice system, this was really central, right? So then to go back and retrace, well, how did we get there, you know, became something that was really fascinating to me. So when there's initially population limits set on Angola, right, you literally can't send folks somewhere, right? So all of a sudden, the sheriffs are just literally being told by the federal courts, you have to keep them, right? Like they have been sentenced or that, you know, they're, you know, supposed to be sent off to Angola and they're not getting taken. So you have to keep them in. And initially the sheriffs were pissed, right? They were so angry because of, I think as you really clearly said, right? Sheriffs don't answer to anyone, right? So to have anyone telling them what they can or can't do was really kind of a shock to them, right? And so they're angry. You know, I mentioned this in the book. Then Sheriff, New Orleans Sheriff Charles Fody at one point, right? He literally dumps like hundreds of prisoners in a parking lot at a prison and is like, take them, which is just a wild stunt. So initially sheriffs are really against this, which I think was surprising for me to find out because that's not how I think of sheriffs today. And so to appease them, they come up with this idea in the state legislature that what if we give them some money? Because one of the, you know, the sheriff's critiques, right, were one, jails are not designed for long-term incarceration. Two, this is costing us money. Three, now we're getting overcrowded and this is bad for us, right? So the state legislature says, okay, what if for every night you house someone, we will give you a, you know, a nominal amount of money? And the sheriffs are like, okay. And it's really low at first in 76. And over time, what happens is folks begin to realize that this is a source of revenue that's really lucrative for them. And I want to be really clear here. When I say lucrative, I mean it allows the sheriffs to build up, as you put it so well, their fiefdoms, their kingdoms, their empires, right, in these parishes. And increasingly, the sheriffs, through the Louisiana Sheriff's Association, right, so they're kind of statewide body, where they organize, start petitioning the legislature for new laws and new funding sources. So first it's, okay, we want the per diems higher. We want more money, basically, right? Then it becomes, what if you all figure out ways to give us money to expand our jails explicitly to increase the number of state prisoners in them? okay, what if you do that and you also guarantee you're going to incarcerate, you're going to send us, 50, 70, 100, 1,000 people. And so we have a kind of steady per diem rate. And especially as parishes and various cities across the state are having their own kind of economic contractions, right? There's less and less money coming from, say, local revenues. So all of a sudden people become dependent on these state revenues, right? And then later on, by the time we get to the 80s, they start kind of making deals at the federal level with which initially INS to start incarcerating immigrant prisoners, right? Or immigrant detainees, especially in some of the more rural parishes. And this is very, contested. The judges are initially not happy about this dynamic at all, but the sheriffs, because they are this powerful kind of political bloc, really are able to organize to the point that by 1998, when for the first time ever, Louisiana has the highest incarceration rate in the world, right? More than 50% of state prisoners are in jail, right? And this is just profound, right? Because we know prisons are terrible. Jails are in many ways worse, right? There's higher rates of premature death in jails. You have higher rates of, right? And there's a lack of programs, worse medical care. Often there's not contact visits, right? There's all these things that make jails really terrible places to be. And it's worth noting, it's not like you got convicted of a kind of a state offense in, let's say East Baton Rouge Parish. And so that means that's what the jail is you're going to. You might end up finding yourself in Monroe, right? Or in Lafayette. So you're not any closer, right, to your folks. So it ends up this thing where the sheriffs become just this incredibly powerful bloc. And it's seen as really appealing to the legislature and governors, right, who have to also be behind it, right? They couldn't do this of their own volition because it's cheaper than building new state prisons. And it's politically in line with their kind of tough on crime attitudes. At the same time that all these folks behind bars are just living in these really horrible conditions, right? And it's really just concentrating all kinds of dehumanization and premature death for folks. And it becomes really profound. It becomes a real site of struggle. And I want to say here, we've seen this, and this is where I say Louisiana, to my knowledge, invented this kind of an arrangement. But we're seeing this as actually now the fastest growing trend of mass incarceration right now, kind of on a data level. So folks at the In Our Backyards program at Barry Institute have been tracking this for the last 5 to 7 years, and their work is really great on this. Kentucky, where I'm sitting right now, it now has close to half of their state prisoners in a jail. California is increasingly doing this. I believe Indiana is doing this. Florida is doing this. So there's this, and it's mostly states in the South and the Midwest, with the exception of California. But we're seeing this move kind of really happen nationally, which for me is always a part about the story of how Louisiana points us to directions that we might take. Not as something that's backwards, but as innovative in kind of these different systems.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bring in California. I mean, the folks that have done a lot of great work out there are obviously hyper familiar with this issue, and AB 109, and and coming off the U.S. Supreme Court decision, this iconic Brown v. Plata decision that they have to stop overcrowding. Does this sound familiar, right? And then the cynics amongst us are like, well, they'll find a way to put them somewhere else. They're not actually going to release anyone. As you mentioned, like that is at your disposal. But no, instead, let's move them down to county level spaces. And I think almost everybody in America, Louisiana included, inherited some of those short-term solutions, which was to shop people out. Another sort of like modern fun fact for everybody is right now, one of the 8 state prison facilities that were built by the state for people incarcerated by the state is actually just being straight leased out. So they can only incarcerate ICE detainees, where they get a higher amount of money from the feds. So when the state says that they're lacking capacity, they're that full, it's like, no, actually you gave away one of your whole prisons. So it's a manufactured crisis. And which helps explain for a lot of people why it's like, well, usually the state was always like about the 51% and the local jails were like the 49%. Why are the jails, what happened, right? Meanwhile, like the population overall went down, but it's because you gave up about 1,200 beds altogether. And just said, here, do it with ICE. So one of the things I found interesting too, as I was going back over my notes,
Hmm.
obviously in the light of this, because I like writing in people's book margins.
Hmm. Me
So
too.
when I was in the joint, I would get the newspaper
Hmm.
and I would actually comment in on the
Hmm.
articles in the paper. And if it was sports, I might like make a funny comment about like this guy being like a bum or whatever, you
Yeah.
know. But if it was like politics, I would actually kind of like editorialize for the
Hmm.
sake
Hmm.
of the guys down the line who would be getting the same newspaper.
Totally.
And because if you're like number one of a paper, then you're able to swap with someone else who's number one. You basically become number two. And so like I got the USA Today and a couple other things. And so I was like high in the chain. So if
Uh-huh.
you read the paper in my cell block, you would get all of Bruce's editorials and
Yeah.
whatever you were reading.
Hmm.
But anyway, so one thing that I noticed is there was a reformer secretary at the time, Paul
Hmm.
Phelps, back
Yeah.
in the in the heyday,
Yeah.
um, who ended up getting thrown out for
Yeah.
pushing back on
Hmm.
some of these crackdowns
Hmm.
and replaced by someone with zero experience.
Right.
This guy John King,
Yeah.
who was a business guy and who then shut the media down in ways, shut down the angle light, kept people
Hmm.
from coming under the prison,
Hmm.
and I just couldn't stop thinking about right now.
Hmm.
And because a lot of people were wondering if Jeff Landry was going to keep Secretary LeBlanc, who's been part
Hmm.
of the reforms, that Governor Edwards was like working on for all these years, these past 8 years. And is he the baby that goes out with the bathwater, even though he's got like 50 years of experience
Hmm.
in corrections?
Hmm.
What can you tell us about Phelps, and maybe even some parallels you might see right now?
Yeah, I think that's just such a helpful thing, right? And I think this is, important to keep in mind because I think for folks who might not, really think about it, right? Who's right? These are political appointees, right? So they do
Mm,
come in and out with governors, right? And they're governors, right? The Department of Corrections lives in the kind of governor sphere and that way of the appointments. And so, you really saw a dramatic shift and what the context was like at Angola, depending on who was the Secretary of Corrections, right? Because who was on the Secretary of Corrections decided who was the warden, who decided all of these other things, right? It's notable because, someone like Paul Phelps, right, allowed for the Angolite to be published as a open, as a uncensored news magazine, right? It allowed folks to have the capacity to do things like organizing at Angola through the Civics Project, right? The Civics Project would not have happened in the way that it did with the kinds of outside support that it was able to gain if there wasn't folks that were saying, all right, you can like come and, or you can't come and go, but folks can come and go, you can have symposiums, we can have more communication, right? It creates a really fertile ground for folks organizing and their kind of personal relationships, right? And so
mhm.
John King, businessman, comes in, leaves again. Phelps comes back in, there's a whole bunch of back and forth, right? And then I think, for me, it always comes down to at that moment that Burl Cain became the warden, right? Which is when so many things got shut down at Angle. I mean, so many
Mm.
things were just shuttered. And so I think people can say it doesn't matter. I think it matters tremendously. And so I think in this current moment, you can also think about the ways in which that the governor's decision of who is in those roles or is not, right? On one hand, they're passing things at the legislature level, right? So we can see that with Landry really clearly in his crime special session, which, just ran through everything that he could possibly brainstorm, I feel like. But on the other hand, who's also in that role also determines the level of disciplinary power or the level of punitiveness for folks who are locked up, right? So if the legislature is deciding kind of the legal sphere, this other dynamic is really deciding who, what does daily life look like for folks, right? What do they have access to?
Mm.
What do they not have access to? And also, what do they organize for or not? Paul Phelps was a guy who would often, and I found this wild to me, right? One of the reasons he gets kicked out is he was writing the kind of first real right-wing governor in Louisiana in the modern sense, David Treen. He's writing him letters all the time being like, do not pass these laws. These are bad laws. Like it's for people who aren't thinking this, he's like, do not pass these tough on crime
Mm.
laws. Do not get rid of, parole for these offenses. This is going to make all of the problems worse. ignored, kicked out, right? So I think for me, that's the question I have, right? Like, is there someone who's going to be thinking on that level or not in an office? And who is challenging, or are you going to have someone who's just going to, say, we can do whatever we want, we can lock things down, we can end visitation, we can make it really difficult for folks to, gain access to the things that they are constitutionally supposed to have, right? We can disinvest, right? I mean, for me, I just keep thinking about all of the, I'm so excited to see this budget work that you're doing, because there's also all of the fights in the last couple of weeks around the crime special section has been people saying, not everyone, but some people saying, this is an enormously expensive thing that you guys are putting forth. Like, you are committing Louisiana to an incredibly expensive system of incarceration. When you're also like turning down money, Landry's case, from the federal government to feed school children in the summer. Like, this is, just totally out of control. And they're saying, oh no, it's not that expensive. And I keep thinking about, it's definitely going to be more expensive. And also, where are the cuts going to come from? And it's going to be in food and healthcare and all of these things, right? So that it really does matter. And it really creates really different kinds of conditions that folks are living under when they're locked up.
Yeah. You were talking about Landry and the crime session, and there's a piece in your book that I think gets at, it could be its own book probably. It gets at something that's really sensitive but really important, which is the victim piece. And and anyone who knows me knows that I've been a victim of crime, and just about everybody I know has been a victim of crime. Some very, very serious crimes as well, and some life-altering events. So when we talk about these issues, like, we're by no means dismissing victims at all, right? We're talking about, like, this is our community. You talk about, like, kind of the leveraging and the manipulation in a political way, the victims. Tell us a little more about that.
Yeah. So, David Treen, right. So it's under him that the Louisiana gets the kind of crime victims kind of fund up and going, which is not unique to Louisiana. And it's happening in the 80s, early 80s, early to mid 80s. It's not unique. It's the one, these are kind of getting built up across the country. And what was really notable to me about this, right, is David Treen is a guy that his articulation of it, right, is really through the language of, we need to protect white women, right? So me as a white woman, it's really paying attention to any moment that, people in my name are getting utilized to justify, like, the increase of policing and imprisonment. And so it really becomes especially around kind of ideas of rape or sexualized violence, right? And again, this is not about being against rape or sexualized violence victims, right? This is that survivorship is important and key and critical, right? But it's this cynical or politically manipulative kind of leveraging of the idea of white women as victims that need to be protected, and that the only protection the state can offer people is not by, I don't know, doing things to undo rape culture, or to, support people's mental well-being and creating different kinds of, mental health resources or what have you. But the answer is to say, we are going to go after these men who, Treen articulates as animals, right? The most kind of racist language you can imagine, in ways that is really about assuming that white men protect white women from these terrifying Black men. And that is what it means to be on team victims' rights, right? And that it's, supported at the same time by things like the LEAA, which are, or the post-LEAA of the Crime Control Act. So there's also federal monies that are going into this. And really, I've learned a lot, especially from women of color, to specifically Black feminist kind of thinkers on this, who often talk about, what does it mean that the Violence Against Women Act is part of the 1994 crime bill, right? Like, how do we actually start decoupling these ideas about how do we support kind of folks, again, around questions of sexualized violence in ways that is not about ratcheting up or increasing punitive penalties, when we know that's never going to, there's no correlation between doing that and ending sexualized violence, right? It's not a commitment to victims, right? It's not a commitment to survivors, but it becomes this powerful political purchase, this powerful narrative, as if these people care about people's lives, when actually they're doing everything that shows us that they just don't actually care about everyone, but it's really strategic in their thinking,
Yeah, if we ever break through, I'm convinced that it's going to be And I'm hopeful, and I hope it's in my lifetime and in my
Mhm.
working lifetime. But if
Mhm.
we ever break through, I feel like it's going to be when we collectively see three things as not being the realm of like crime punishment, or at least not
Right.
just through that lens. One is relationship challenges
Right.
and a lot of this domestic violence stuff. Like clearly these people at some point like loved each other and
Totally.
they've got kids together, they like maybe live, so all that stuff. Like there's more to it than just some stranger danger stuff, right? And
Mhm.
then two is addiction, which obviously that also plays into relationship stuff, right? But like as we know, this is a health issue. And then three would be mental health stuff, which also plays into those two things. Like if we could ever take a public health approach to those three
Right.
things and
Mhm.
stop just seeing it as like, I'm going to punish the hell out of this particular perpetrator, thinking that everyone else is going to watch it and be like, I'm never going to do
Right.
that.
Right. Right.
It's a very like unscientific
No.
belief system that I'm sure a lot of people don't, but there's like this love of punishment or
Yeah.
something. There's this culture of punishment and like Old Testamentism or something
Exactly.
that
I was about
people
to
just love.
say it's about, yeah, Laura McTighe, who works with women with a vision is wonderful, right? She often talks about it as, right, that punishment is the American religion. And I find that
Mm,
such a powerful articulation, right? Because it is,
mm-hmm,
it's like, it is Old Testament, right? It's this like very punitive orientation when we know there is no correlation between increasing punishments and increasing safety, right?
mm-hmm,
And so I think that's the other challenge is how do we decouple this notion, right? That
mm-hmm,
punishment creates safety, or even thinking about what is harm or violence and what are the ways in which we get redress that's actually about trying to make people as whole as possible from these things,
mm-hmm,
right? That are expansive and are not about the disposability of anyone, but actually thinking about how are we investing in people and their lives in all the kinds of ways, even or maybe especially when really harmful or violent things occur, right? How do we actually kind of
mm-hmm.
deepen our commitments to people and their humanity in those most difficult moments instead of saying, all right, you're done, right? We can dispose of you and throw you in there and you're going to be locked up for the next, until your dying day, basically.
Yeah, and like really kind of expanding the cycle with each sort of incarceration and just
Mhm,
making the circle a little bit bigger. And
mhm,
I believe you noted there was a report under Governor Romer,
mhm,
1990,
mhm,
where their person, whoever it was that wrote it or collective,
mhm, mhm.
said that prison expansion is actually counterproductive
Yeah,
to stopping crime,
right.
right? And for all these reasons, as we know about like reentry challenges and
Mm,
discrimination and family
mhm.
disruption and
Right,
not getting actual treatment while you're
right.
away, just
Yeah.
literally sitting on ice,
Hmm.
being subjected to all these like traumatic
Exactly.
scenarios on a daily.
Right.
But here we are again,
Right.
so 90 to till when is how many years now? 35
34,
years?
30.
30,
Yeah, basically.
dang.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, wow, like we're just really like not reinventing the wheel. We're just like pulling out an old dusty, like terrible wheel that doesn't roll and being like, here
Hmm.
we go.
Right.
But for some hope for our listener and audience and people within earshot, I like to just reflect on the reality of, in 1990 and 1970, like when these things kind of hit their cycle previously, the media was totally just like taking notes from the
Mhm.
incarcerators.
Yeah.
They would just like they wouldn't be critical. Not to disparage all of them, but for the most part, like the mainstream media was just like
Mhm.
on board.
Right.
A lot of it was bipartisan, as we
Hmm.
know, like the
Hmm.
Clinton era work. You mentioned like Dutch Morial and
Hmm.
his complicity in a lot of these things.
Hmm.
Um, and we didn't have organizations like we do, like you just mentioned, Women in the Vision, Vote,
Right.
like others
Hmm.
that are strong, have a history, have a
Hmm.
reach, credibility. And so I really think that we can do much better, not to say that we won't take like a hit, but we can do much better in taking the hit and maybe bouncing back.
Yeah.
This is my faith.
I mean, I think that's not wrong. I mean, I think it's hard, right? I don't want to overemphasize. I hate it when people are
Mm-hmm.
like, "We're winning." When you're like, "I just watched this crime special session." Like, winning feels like a more positive spin than I would do, right? But I would say we are prepared, right? I think
Mm-hmm.
that's the question. I mean, it's also how do we deal with these moments, right? Where, we know that Landry got something like 18% of the people of Louisiana to vote for him. So it's what we're seeing now is, whereas you might have seen in previous eras, the majority of the population on this team. I am not convinced the majority of the population is on this team, actually. I think the question becomes, though, how do we, again, move folks from either what might be nihilism or there's nothing that's possible to thinking about, no, we are in a different political landscape, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in 1990, there was not a language around mass incarceration, right? There was not a language around in certain corners, there were critiques, obviously, but you're right. You could not get an op-ed in a newspaper, right? You could not get, politicians to come out against this, right? It was a full block. And I think we are in a different landscape. And so the question becomes how are we not just fighting back against this in this kind of reactionary mode, but also thinking what's the long-term plan to get out of this kind of situation altogether? And how are we fighting on both of those fronts, I think is really, for me, key. And I think folks are I think the vote, there wasn't a vote in 1980 or 1990 or whatever, when the legislature was doing this stuff, showing up at the legislature and speaking out, or you didn't have, our legislators who are, against the kind of Landry regime are less than I would like, but you have someone like Mandy Landry, for instance. Oh, poor Mandy Landry, same last name, very Louisiana, right? People like this, right? Tweeting out, being this is happening, this thing's terrible, and other, and many other folks also who are critiquing this. And so I think the question is, how are we actually also thinking about that as a different moment to be pushing back against not just this kind of administration, but the longer term work. And while it is very disheartening to see all the bills that are getting passed and, the rolling back of even modest gains and the creation of new kind of really reactionary laws, is also that laws are made by people, right? And so they can be unmade by people, and other kinds of laws can be made, right? It's not an end result we're in, right? We're in this kind of fluid, ongoing process, and to keep that in mind too.
Well, Lydia, one other thing that you couldn't do back then is you couldn't Google up the link to Prison Capital, which I believe is available like Amazon Books and all the other kinds of things.
Yeah, anywhere. Yeah. And I will say this, it's very kind. What I did here, I want to say this, I heard a great news that a friend sent it in to someone actually in Angola, to their friend in Angola, and it's getting read in there. Now there's a line to read it. So I got some names of some folks that I'm going to be sending it into. I'm actually today after we get off the call. So,
Well, I'll just share for the listening audience something that I try to maybe holler at you in the mix, but only in Louisiana or only in New Orleans could I be driving a vehicle in a parade with a giant sound system and my vehicle and talking to the DJ, because we're the crew to Vangra.
Yeah.
And I'm actually talking about your book. And then who do I see about 4 minutes later on the parade route, but you? And I was like, this is insane. So that was also my reminder of really want to have this conversation with you. So I really appreciate both of us are kind of finding this time to dive deep. Obviously we're both nerds on the subject matter, and I apologize to anyone listening and being like, damn, you had to go that deep, but it's good to know that these resources are there for people who do want to go there. And and then, for instance, those of us who are organizers, regular folks, whatever, it helps to then sometimes translate some of the heavy reading. I know you condensed a lot of material to put this book together. And so people like myself, it's trying to condense it even further for maybe folks who are not as inclined to read the whole book, which I totally respect. But do you have any parting gifts, thoughts, words for the folks?
Well, obviously it's been such a delight to be here, but the other thing I want to say is people made this happen, right? Which means people could unmake it. I just think that's, so much of why I feel sometimes I get into the weeds of being these people did things here, these people did things there. Also, people organize against these things here and there, is to really map out all of these different spaces. And there's not a silver bullet. It's not just you just focus on the sheriffs, or you just focus on the police, or you just focus on the governor, but really trying to show people if all of these different spaces had to be utilized to make Louisiana be an epicenter of mass incarceration, then we have so many really clear targets for folks to work to make a different kind of Louisiana for not just us right now, but the future of Louisiana as well.
Most definitely. And just and one final shout out to a portion of your book that really lifts up the work of Breakout and and kind of like using them as a window into the policing tensions, which I think it's a really good part of the book. And for the folks that are thinking about like how do we create a safe community, I think it's a lot of good material to help people think about that as well. But with that, I definitely want to say thanks again for being on, and I hope people do pick this book up. People that know me closest can borrow this one off me. And we're gonna see you soon next time you're in New Orleans.
Great, thanks so much for engaging, Bruce. It's been such a pleasure. Take care.
Cool. All right. Bye, Lydia.
Bye.